Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Path Ahead webinar series. I'm really excited about the topic today and the guests. I think it's pretty unprecedented and much needed. So I want to thank in advance all of our guests for participating. We are going to take a look at e-bikes on front country trails, particularly non-motorized trails, and get real-time insights about Helena's popular non-motorized trail system from the perspective of the land managers and the users. So today we are welcoming Kristi Ponozzo, who is the City of Helena's Parks and Recs Director, Mary Hollow, City Partner and Prickly Pear Land Trust Executive Director, Eric Grove. I struggled a little bit for a title for Eric, but we're going with Outdoor Recreation Leader. Kathy Bushnell, who is the Helena District Ranger in the Helena, Lewis and Clark National Forest, and Brad Colin from the BLM Outdoor, he's an outdoor recreation planner with the Butte office. Next slide. So just for housekeeping, if we're going to do Q&A, so be sure to, we'll deal with it at the end. So if you have questions or comments, please provide input in the chat box or the Q&A. If you have problems, technical problems with Zoom, you can text your issue to Andy, who's on the back end here, who can help you. Next slide. So the key takeaways, as you probably saw when you signed up, are what are e-bikes and what are the issues of e-bikes on non-motorized trail? We'll look briefly, because we only have an hour and a half today to deal with this issue, which is complex. How other communities like Moab and Boise treat e-bikes on their multi-jurisdictional natural surface trail systems. Looking ahead, how do e-bikes fit into Helena's transportation system and recreation system and other communities, similarly situated communities, and management challenges and opportunities for the partners in a trail system like Helena's, which are the city, project partners, and federal land managers who are connected or regionally connected from a recreation standpoint to the Helena system. The reason we're looking at Helena is Helena captures a lot of the issues that a lot of our front country systems are facing. Next slide. First, a little background about the series. The Office of Outdoor Recreation Montana Access Project partnered up to provide in-depth content for outdoor recreation champions, land managers, and with an emphasis on front country and rural, because if there's anything that all of us can know and share is front country recreation is hard. It's just hard. There are multiple partners, there are multiple lands, there's multiple funding, there's funding challenges, there's management challenges, there's maintenance challenges, capacity challenges, etc. So this series helps level the playing field a little bit for rural communities, and that's the intent. Next slide. The reason why we're here, value of outdoor recreation. We know that it's a huge economic driver in Montana and the country. Next. We know that it enhances the quality of life. We know that it's an economic driver. We know it's the #1 reason that tech businesses give for locating in Montana. We know that it's a key component of livability. Next. And finally, we all know, especially with COVID, has spotlighted this. The outdoor in natural surroundings is very healing, very important for exercise, recreation, our kids, our families, and they're the places that we meet and socialize. Next. In this series, I generally focus on a key to success for successful front country recreation systems. The keys for this episode are focusing on partnerships and operations and management and maintenance. Next. So, as I said, we're focusing on Helena because Helena captures a lot of the attributes that a lot of our front country systems have. I'm in Whitefish, very involved with the Whitefish Trail and Whitefish Legacy Partners. We have a mishmash of ownerships and ownership segments, management strategies, and land managers in our trail system that leads from town, front country to the back country. So does Helena, Bozeman, many of our communities that have places to recreate close to home that connect to other public lands, whether they're state public lands or federal public lands, are all facing these issues and challenges. Helena is a great example and probably one of the most mature trail systems like this in the state. So we're all experiencing and learning right along with Helena. I'm going to say this now, I'll probably say it again and again, but I wanted to tell people what the focus of this webinar is. This focus is about multi-jurisdictional trail systems and from the land manager's perspective. We're not going to talk about whether e-bikes are a good thing or a bad thing. We're not going to focus on whether e-bikes should be allowed or not, or whether they should be banned. What we are going to focus on is a snapshot of the current state of affairs of Helena's system. We're going to look at where e-bikes are allowed and not allowed on that system and why. We're going to look at management considerations from the perspective of each of those land managers. And we're going to look at how to get engaged and stay engaged in local discussions around the trail system and e-bikes. Next. So to reiterate, we're really going to focus on a subset of e-bikes. If you look at this chart, they're all e-bikes. They're e-bikes on roadways and natural surface, active transportation, hard surfaces, paved roads, bike paths. That's not going to be the focus today. We're going to look at natural surface motorized access. That won't be the focus today. What we are looking at is natural surface non-motorized and some of the issues around that have come up in this legislative session that are coming up now, and taking a more nuanced look at the puzzle pieces that fit together to provide users in places like Helena a seamless experience as they travel on these beautiful trails through nature. Next. So about e-bikes, I mean, what can you say? This top e-bike, that's an e-bike. They don't look like they used to. They don't have a big battery pack on them like they did back in the day. And if you look on the right, you'll see that, you know, they catch a pretty price. This Santa Cruz bicycle is $12,000. So e-bikes are emerging. They're emerging as a method of transportation. Next slide. Globally, the market is almost $24 billion in 2020. According to this market report, Asia is by far the largest segment. Europe is second, and this market segment is expected to grow by 12% by 2026, which is just a few years. So there are two, and the way the industry looks at this is there are two segments: pedal assisted and throttle. The applications are generally city and urban and mountain bike. They call it trekking in Europe, but that's off road, off pave. Two types of batteries, lithium and lead acid. And in the industry, it's categorized as less than 250 watts and above 250 watts. Next. I don't have the numbers for the US. Not that they're not out there, it's just that I'm not an economic expert. But in Europe, if you look at this graph, you can see that the bicycle sales are expected to increase. E-bikes increase, traditional bikes decrease over the next till 2030. Next. So generally, here are the pros and cons. We're not going to focus on these or get into whether they're right or wrong. I'm just going to put them out there to frame the discussion. The pros say it helps aging population stay active. It helps less fit people stay active. It increases the number of people who can get out on the trails. It makes riding farther, longer, easier. And in terms of impact of an e-bike versus a mountain bike, the class ones are very similar because class ones is we'll learn about them, but they're pedal assist. You pedal them, it's just easier to pedal them. The arguments against e-bikes, and particularly on non-motorized trails. Remember that chart I said, this is what we're focused on. We're not focusing on whether e-bikes are a good thing or a bad thing. A motor means a motor. And when you blur the line and don't call it that it's not a motor or it isn't a motor, that it really blurs the line with restricting motorized access on non-motorized trails, which has been a very traditional distinction. The regulation of these bikes, because the technology is increasing so fast and just adapting, is going to be tough. There's you got to earn the downhill kind of feeling among bicyclists and mountain bikers, traditional. There's a speed challenge, meaning that it's easier. Oh, I'm out of time already. Easier to go faster. Enforceability is super difficult. I mean, it's really difficult to tell the difference between an electric versus traditional bike, and it will become more difficult. And between class 1, 2, and 3, really difficult to tell. I did a little test. I just said I want to buy a class 1 e-bike on Google shopping search. I'd have to be an expert to determine whether the bikes they pulled up to me for me are class 1 or not, because they're not marketed that way. Wildlife conflicts, of course, traveling farther, faster, trail damage, and a new user group potentially challenges the trail capacity and increases the potential user conflict. Next. So from the user experience, this is how we see it. There are lots of trailheads. Next slide. Lots of places to go, beautiful map. You can see you lead from the Prickly Pear city system into the national forest system, expansive opportunities. Next slide. From a land manager's perspective, and I don't have a really beautiful map for this, but you can see the patchwork of land ownership. The blue is state, the yellow is BLM, the green is Forest Service, and the gray is city. Next. So we'll get started, and our presentation is going to reflect the recreation flow that people customarily use on the Helena Trail system. So first, we'll hear from Kristi. Next, we'll hear from the city's partner, Mary Hollow, from the Prickly Pear Land Trust. Third, we'll hear about the trail user e-bike advocacy perspective. Next, as you flow into the Forest Service, we'll hear from Kathy. I'm sorry, I misspelled her name there, Kathy Bushnell. And next, we'll hear about the regional connections and potential regional connections with Brad Colin from BLM. But so just to point out, from the land manager's perspective, that trail is not a seamless flow. It's a jigsaw puzzle of coordinated land management partners. Next slide. So Kristi, I'm going to turn it over to you. And if I've forgotten anything or left anything out or misstated, please feel free to chime in. But I'm going to let Kristi take it away.
Great. Thanks, Diane. I'm Kristi Ponozzo. I'm the Parks Director for the City of Helena. And our Parks Department oversees our Open Lands Division. And I think can you advance to the next slide? Next. Yeah, and go ahead and go to the next as well. We've got 2,000 acres of open lands that are largely the Mount Helena and Mount Ascension Trail System. It's about 40 acres, 40 miles of designated multi-use recreational trails. And those are for anything from biking, hiking, running. People walk their dogs. There's snowshoeing and cross-country skiing in the wintertime. And of course, just a lot of general flora, fauna, geological, cultural expeditions, or people generally using our open lands for multiple use recreation. Next slide. So our roles and responsibilities as land managers of a non-motorized system, we really look at our 2,000 acres of open lands as sort of a gateway in a lot of respects. Much of our open lands are bordered by the Forest Service. We have some small portions of BLM and state land, and of course, a lot of private lands and many neighbors. Many people access our open lands from the city through private sometimes. Often they don't realize that they're even accessing public lands through private lands. It's all very seamless to them. And we try to manage in that context that our 2,000 acres of open land can't be everything to everybody, but we can provide recreation amenities in those 2,000 acres, and we can provide access to larger landscapes like that of the Forest Service and like the BLM. So we look at it in from a regional perspective, that we provide a piece in the larger region of recreation opportunities. Next slide. So our current situation regarding e-bikes, we updated our open lands management plan about 1.5 years ago. We updated specifically the recreation chapter. We had sort of a robust public involvement process for that. It identifies goals and objectives. And one of those specific goals, because we heard so much from the community that it was important, was to develop an e-bike policy for our open lands. We started sort of working on this policy with our Open Lands Management Advisory Committee with some research and some discussions. There was a lot of discussion around the definition of motorized and non-motorized that we have in our resolutions and ordinances for the city. And there was a dearth of definition of e-bike. E-bikes is not mentioned, of course, anywhere in our resolutions or ordinances because they were written before there were e-bikes. So there weren't definitions there. So there were a lot of conversations about that. We finally got some direction from our Helena City Commission to define e-bikes as motorized. And therefore they're predominantly prohibited at this point from Helena open lands that are mostly Mount Ascension and the Mount Helena areas. We have other open lands throughout the city, but those are the main trail systems that folks associate our open lands with. We decided to also, and got direction from our commission to also sort of launch a public process on what e-bikes would look like throughout the city, not just open lands, looking at trails, looking at e-bikes for commuting purposes and what that might look like. So could you advance the next slide, please? So this is sort of our map of trails within our, it is not the prettiest map, I apologize, but sort of the map of our hard surface trails, our open lands trails, our bike lanes. We have sort of Centennial Trail is one of our big sort of commuter hard surface trails. It connects to other places outside the city, other trail systems. And it also, and we want more connectivity to our open lands trail system. So we think about it from a regional perspective with other land management agencies, but also the connectivity of transportation and biking and walking within our city. So next slide. So as I said, we're starting a public engagement process. We want to look at the potential benefits and challenges that e-bikes and e-scooters are a part of this conversation, because we had a company that's come to town that wants to have a business. They want to rent e-scooters throughout the city. So there was a lot of conversation about those being defined virtually the same as an e-bike, same sort of technology. The goal of our campaign is to inform future decisions on appropriate locations for e-bikes and scooters throughout the city. So we want to be able to tell people where it's appropriate to ride an e-bike or an e-scooter and where it's not, and for that to be very, very clear. And we're going to complete this broader discussion by December. Right now we have a survey out, it's on our website, and we have an interactive public engagement tool called Be Heard Helena. So it not only has the survey there, but it'll have ability for people to submit comments there. And it provides other sorts of information, including that map that I just showed and other pieces of information about e-bikes. So, you know, throughout this process, we're going to be looking at and considering research and other policies that are adopted by other municipalities and, of course, other land management agencies. We're looking to create a working group with representation from our different city advisory boards that have sort of connection to this topic. We're going to research and analyze different options and alternatives, including potentially looking at a pilot study this summer. We're going to include rationale on potential alternatives and why e-bikes and e-scooters would or would not be appropriate in certain areas. And we're going to continue to work with other land management agencies like the Forest Service and the BLM. And one of our big considerations, of course, is enforcement and whatever policies we ultimately adopt, how we enforce that and what those look like. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. And for those of you who want to participate, I mean, I'm sure you can get in touch with the city if you'd like to do the survey or send Kristi an email. We do have her contact information at the end of this presentation. Next in that recreation flow and as a city partner, I would like to introduce Mary Hollow. And Mary, if you can talk a little bit about yourself and your background, and of course explain talk more about your role as a city partner in making those seamless trail systems available to folks from everywhere now, not just Helena. Next slide.
All right, thanks for having me, and Diane, thanks for pulling this together. So I, in addition to what was just on the screen, I grew up in Helena, and there wasn't a trail system here. My husband did too, and there wasn't a trail system here when we were growing up. Part of the reason, and one of the main reasons that we were drawn back to Helena, was the work that PPLT had done in the time that we were gone. I have been the director at PPLT now for almost 7 years, and in that time, we have seen some pretty significant, obviously, community evolution, but also a major evolution in how the South Hills Trail system operates, functions, how many people use it, how it's been developed out. So I wanted to highlight, for the purposes of this panel, the key roles that land trusts play in, as Diane and I started talking about this, every community where there is a major developed trail system, there is a land trust partner that is operating to sort of bridge the public and private divide. And our obligations are very different than government, and our role ends up being very different, but complementary as well. So we, the land trust sort of fills in and builds out from the spaces where government operates. In the South Hills in Helena, we have been for 25 years acquiring land parcel by parcel. And so we raise the money, we purchase the land, and then we donate that land to the city of Helena. The map that you're looking at, the parts that are, and it's not just the city of Helena, I should actually say the Forest Service, BLM, other public partners as well. So the map that you're looking at shows all of the additions that PPLT has made to the South Hills since 1996. So we turned 25 this year, and essentially we've been acquiring and donating land as a part of our trails program. We have obviously private lands and community conservation programs separate to this work, as do the other urban or regional land trusts in the state. So it's a similarity that you can draw to, again, to any front country trail system. The lands represented here in yellow are about half of the lands that represent, actually maybe a little bit more than that, the public land estate in the South Hills. You know, the partnership is so mutually beneficial and also just so critical for the operation of the South Hills, in with how the city or the Forest Service manages the trails or maintains certain aspects of the resource. The role of the land trust in, you know, being able to raise private dollars for acquisition, private dollars for maintenance. We also, as sort of a quasi entity, we can hold trail easements. So in Helena, we hold about a dozen really key access trail easements that cross what Kristi was talking about, the lands that where the public system is accessed via private property. In Helena, the land trust holds those trail easements. That is also the case in several of the other communities, with GVLT, Five Valleys Land Trust, and I think up in the Flathead too with Whitefish Trails, obviously. We work with the various user groups. Obviously, one of the evolutions that we've really seen in our region is the prominence and organization of a lot of different user groups that are advocating for a certain angle or specificity on the system or a specific trail, you know, and representing a certain type of trail user group, biking, hiking, running, kids, all sorts of stuff. And it's, that's been, you know, kind of a, I guess, more recent evolution. Obviously those groups have been around for a long time, but we've just seen a more formalized version of them in the last 6 years, I guess. Prickly Pear Land Trust, as the and the other regional land trusts too, we provide staff capacity for things like trail maintenance. We coordinate volunteers. We also, outside of that, provide other community options for recreation or public access. You know, the regional land trusts seek to help the community in the area where they work connect in a variety of ways to the outdoors, providing fishing access sites, providing other park and trail options. In Helena, good examples of that are 10 Mile Creek Park, and that's actually an example of a place where we do have trails that allow e-bikes. And then we've worked with the BLM on the scratch gravels proposals to try and help envision or figure some sort of solution if there's a role for the land trust in that. And then also on our most recent acquisition in East Helena, where we have the predominant place where working class families are buying houses and really starting to live. The East Helena community, we acquired about 330 acres at the end of the year. That'll be another community conservation park, kind of like 10 Mile Creek. So again, just bridging that public and private role with ways that complement the outdoor and trail offerings. So our obligations, our role is different than government. And one of the things that we do when we take on land is that we raise money from a number of different sources. And in some cases, those funding sources require certain deed restrictions or certain requirements on the funding that they provide. In the South Hills, we've used several different types of funding. We've used land and water conservation funding. We've used different CFP and Farm Bill and Department of Ag and Interior funding. We've used open space bond funding. We've used obviously lots of private funding. And then we have also used funding from trusts. In particular, the one that came up recently is a trust that's key for wildlife conservation values. And as a wildlife conservation entity, anytime that entity funds projects, it restricts motorized use. And so the deed restrictions that we transferred, in this case, they were to the city, they had very specific language that restricted motorized use. Those transfers happened, 10 years ago, but that's, the language is crystal clear, and those deed restrictions are a legal requirement now for the city that holds them. As just sort of an interesting example, but also just to kind of underscore the need for the management and the role of the public managers as well as the partner organizations. That deed restriction, which restricts any motorized use, also comes with a reversionary clause. And that just means that if the deed isn't upheld, that land can go away. And it's, I think, just an important part of the patchwork quilt consideration that public land managers have when they look at a topic like e-bikes or like wildlife or whatever the topic is. There are just a lot of different filters sort of behind the screens that the public may or may not be aware of. And as sort of a key one recently, that was one that came up in Helena, and that is definitely the case in other communities as well. So just, yeah, as the regional land trust here, and one that really started out, of all the regional land trusts in the state, Prickly Pear started out more in public lands and trails than the others. The others tended to start in private land conservation and then move into trail systems. But now we all have the same suite of programming because we respond to community needs. And in the urban areas, front country trail systems are, as Diane pointed out, just a key amenity that that communities want and need. So it's exciting to celebrate 25 years this year, and the partnership with the awesome public land managers here on this call, and sort of the unique role that the land trusts and other private entities can play. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Mary. I know Mary mentioned it. I'll mention it again. You can go to the next slide. Many of us have key segments that connect public land that are through private land. And commonly, if you look at ownership patterns of cities, they are private land. So if you want to move from city to private, private land to public land, the public land is generally not within the city limits. So there's generally a public connection piece, a private connection piece. So thank you, Mary. Next up is Eric Grove, and I will let him introduce himself a little bit. Eric and I were brainstorming. My view of highlighting the topic of e-bikes was a little less robust, and just sort of, I was thinking about following up on e-bikes during the legislative session. But as Eric and I talked a little bit, we realized that, in Montana, Helena is a little bit on the tip of the spear of some of the management challenges and opportunities that a lot of other communities are facing. So we sort of decided to put the jigsaw puzzle concept together and fill people in on what's happening on the advocacy side and the user side. So Eric, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane. And why don't we go to the first slide? And first of all, just to say a few quick things about my personal involvement. First of all, I am from Helena. I grew up here. I owned the bike shop in Helena for 30 years. So I have 30 years of advocating for cycling, actually more than that, but 30 years as a bike shop owner. And then finally, through that 30 years and now until today, I've been actively involved in advocacy for non-motorized trails with an emphasis on mountain bikes. So I have a long history in both cycling and in advocacy for non-motorized trails. I also want to make a little disclaimer because I do think this is important in this discussion. I am very much an e-bike advocate. I'm very much of a proponent of e-bikes. But like a lot of folks, I have serious concerns about motorized use on non-motorized trails, a lot because it reflects my involvement with non-motorized trails over the years. Now, that being said, my role today is not to argue the merits or the faults of e-bikes. Rather, it is to provide objective information to better understand Montana's current e-bike policy and how it affects local policy, the role of national advocacy in developing state policy, and policy implementation examples in other communities. So let's take a look and see what Montana has to say about e-bike. As you can see, Montana code really doesn't go much beyond defining e-bike as a bicycle. It doesn't give a lot of direction, rather, as it currently sits. It more or less gives substantial discretion to local jurisdictions to develop policies on where and how e-bikes are to be used. And as a consequence, it leaves the possibility that local jurisdictions can have a wide range of policies towards e-bikes. And those policies may not always align. So for instance, Missoula might have policies that allow one thing, Helena may have policies that allow another. So due to that, I think it illustrates the need, and I think this is something that almost everyone can agree on, is the need for not only some level of uniformity between communities, but also, even more importantly, probably between states, where in some cases, e-bikes are considered mopeds, for instance, in North Dakota. And that different regulation scheme means things like registration, insurance, and licensing. So you can see the real problem from that perspective is that, you buy your e-bike in Montana, you go to North Dakota thinking you're gonna have a great weekend, and all of a sudden you run into some problems, some hurdles. So you can go to the next slide. How is this inconsistency being addressed between these different state and then localities in terms of how they're dealing with e-bikes? So first of all, there's a national advocacy that's working in that direction called People for Bikes. And their mission is simple: to get more people riding bikes more often, to make bike riding better for everyone. Now, I think it's important to point out here that People for Bikes is an industry-funded advocacy. It's an industry-funded organization. And I'm not pointing that out because it's good or bad, but it is not a grassroots organization. And in that respect, and I'm going to say just briefly, quickly, that there is a gap in advocacy. While there have been grassroots organizations locally, like Montana, Bike Walk Montana has come forth to support e-bike transportation. There's really not an equivalent grassroots organization in Montana that I'm aware of, organization, I guess it makes sense, for natural surface trail related issues. And what's really missing from the conversation in places like Helena is that we need a local organized e-bike advocacy, not just supporters, not just folks who ride e-bikes, but we need folks to get together and organize, because I think as a bicycling advocate for close to 40 years, I can say that it would be a mistake to rely, especially when it comes to natural surface trails, to rely on existing advocacy. And in many ways, for us to have a robust conversation, not just in Helena, but in other communities in Montana, we really need folks to come to the table as a group who represent e-bike use and e-bike users. So that being said, back to the national advocacy. People for Bikes obviously recognizes the potential for e-bikes to represent what they represent and to increase the cycling community. and the potential positive impact for transportation, particularly for underserved communities. And then they also recognize, perhaps the 900-pound gorilla in the room, is that there isn't consistency between state policies. And that provides some pretty big barriers for folks who are interested in purchasing e-bikes, and also for people who are interested in selling e-bikes. Just having those inconsistencies across state lines is really problematic. So what are they doing about it? You can jump to the next slide. So what People for Bikes has done is come up with model legislation. And that model legislation is an effort to kind of provide that consistency across states, and then in turn provide consistency across communities. It does two important things. Next slide. First of all, it provides a better definition of the e-bikes, and it does this, and I think probably most of you out there are familiar with the classes that have been created, class 1, class 2, and class 3. I think perhaps a lot of people don't realize that the primary reason for these class distinctions and better definition of e-bikes is really safety related. And instead of having a one size fits all, and recognizing that e-bikes can have a power assist anywhere from 15 miles per hour up to 28 miles per hour, that the one size fits all kind of gives communities an all or nothing option. And that's really not good enough as this technology develops more and more and becomes more popular. So really what the 3-bike class system does is gives local entities or states or agencies a little bit more surgical approach to determining where e-bikes can be allowed and where they cannot be allowed. And that's important and has been adopted by lots of different organizations, communities, and states. Next slide. So there's kind of 4 key elements to that legislation, that model legislation in terms of rules. So we talked about definitions. Now, the other probably big component is infrastructure rules for e-bikes. And as you can see from points 1, 2, and 3, those rules are really ways to deal with what I'm going to call the hard infrastructure, or more likely hard infrastructure. As you can see from number 1, basically says that bikes are going to be allowed on all places where e-bikes will be allowed, all places where normal bikes are allowed. But it then gives some jurisdictional control over class 1 and class 2 if there's a safety concern. And then finally with class 3, it basically says local jurisdictions will have regulatory control over class 3 e-bikes. For our conversation today, though, number 4 is really the one that's most important. So when People for Bikes was developing their legislation, they had a lot of conversations. I had a conversation with People for Bikes to kind of better understand this issue. And what they found is that unlike hard infrastructure, designated non-motorized trails, natural surface trails, really are have a long history and can typically have a fairly long history in communities. They've been around for years or decades, and they have a tradition and a culture of use, and also a tradition of fundraising that's very local. While they may use funds, as Mary pointed out, RTP grants for trail development might be one of those things. Really, the biggest investment is from the community. And so in this model legislation, the realization was that it really is local control is really important here. And that's what people kept telling them. So they incorporated into their model legislation under rules, really to put the designation of or e-bike regulation back into the lap of the local entity when it came to those kinds of trail systems like Helena Open Lands. So next slide. So that kind of summarizes the model legislation. So what has Montana done with it? Well, that brings us to the recently completed legislative session in House Bill 281. So there were several pieces of legislation that moved forward dealing with e-bikes, but they were consolidated in this last legislative session under House Bill 281. And what 281 did was it did incorporate most of the model legislation, actually point for point in many cases, but there was one critical omission. So I should say one thing it also did is it didn't include that provision for non-motorized, designated non-motorized natural surface trails. It basically took that provision completely out of the legislation. And what that did is kicked the responsibility of determining how e-bikes were going to be used on those local trail systems kind of back up to the state. And that concerned a lot of people. And so as a consequence, there was a fair amount of pushback on that legislation, and it ended up dying in the Senate. When I talked to both opponents and proponents of that legislation, they both I think entities pointed to that omission of the designated non-motorized natural trails provision. Because it was omitted, that really was the death knell of the legislation. So where does that leave us? First of all, there's no reason why local communities can't use the model legislation template moving forward. And in fact, that's kind of what has been happening. Next slide, please. So it appears that most communities have done that. And since Helena is kind of in the point of evaluating e-bike policy, we can look to other communities to kind of get a chance to see how those communities are doing things. I should say that this list includes communities that have adopted e-bike policies. So I want to make sure that people understand there are communities out there that haven't adopted e-bike policies that do allow e-bikes on their natural surface designated non-motorized trails. But today we're dealing with policy and how it affects these things. So to point out how some have kind of handled this, again, close to home, Missoula has prohibited e-bikes on natural surface trails. They took this on about 3 years ago, came up with an e-bike policy, but then embraces kind of the e-bike guidelines under model legislation for the rest of the community. Moab, actually, you can't really have a conversation about mountain bikes without talking about Moab. And Moab, again, this has been something that's been in place for quite some time. They do prohibit e-bikes on non-motorized, designated non-motorized trails. I think an interesting approach to Moab is that they are really highlighting their motorized trails as opportunities for e-bike users. That's another approach. There is the approach that Kristi actually mentioned about doing some pilot programs. And that is in fact the case in Colorado, where several programs have taken place. One more model would be Boise and Park City, Idaho, both of which have put restrictions, prohibitions on their natural surface trails. But they also have an ADA, both communities have incorporated an ADA provision, whereby if you have a mobility disability, you can apply for a permit that then has to be displayed on the bike, and that gives you access to the trail system. Also worth mentioning that in Park City, that applies to 65-plus-year-olds. Okay, next slide. So where do we go from here? Well, as Kristi has pointed out, we have a robust public process that's moving forward. And that will get underway sort of in earnest towards the fall. I have to point out that public process came from a collaborative effort, of which I was involved. And it's a very thorough public process, and it really shows the benefits of collaboration. And so I'm going to close out my conversation in talking about collaboration a little bit. There's a huge opportunity for our community, for Helena, to proceed collaboratively, as there is for other communities as well. And I'm a real fan of stakeholders coming together on their own, kind of outside and in front of, in this case, in front of the actual public policy that the city is going to take on, trying to work towards consensus that then can be brought forward into that public process. Really what it takes is people who are willing to work towards a solution. And there is a solution here. It may be Helena Open Lands, it may be partially Helena Open Lands, or it may be not Helena Open Lands at all. But there is a solution, and it just is a matter of our community coming together to work on it. And there, there's the big C word, the willingness to compromise. That's a big part of collaboration, and that's going to be part of what's going to happen moving forward. So I just want to let the local folks who are watching this know that I am going to make an effort to organize a collaborative effort If you are, again, willing to come forward on your own and take part in this with the willingness to talk to folks who may not agree with you, but try to work towards a solution and be willing to compromise, then I would welcome you contacting me with the contact information that will be provided at the end of this presentation. And that's all I've got. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. An amazing amount of information packed into exactly 15 minutes. So good job. You can see the topic is complex, and the technology is complex. We're, as I said before, we're not, we in this limited time we have, we're not diving into the issues of motor versus non-motor. Is it a motor? Isn't it a motor? Should it be allowed? Not allowed? But truth, and we also haven't dealt with the technology advances. I mean, in one of Eric's slides, I don't know if you picked it up, but it showed a picture of an e-bike that has a removable battery cartridge, and so it can convert from an e-bike to a non-e-bike by inserting the battery cartridge. So it's just an intent. The intent is just to sort of open the dialogue and point out some of the issues that are coming up in this space. Next, we have, is in our recreation flow coming from town into front country to back country, we have Kathy Bushnell. I'll allow her to introduce herself, but suffice it to say that that seamless experience that we all enjoy, a big part of it is the Forest Service. And the Forest Service, as Kathy will point out, has specific rules and regulations regarding e-bikes on non-motorized trails. So she will also remind us that we are not talking about e-bikes writ large. There are plenty of places for e-bikes on motorized trails, designated trails, which she'll talk about. But Kathy will walk us through the Forest Service approach to e-bikes. So thank you, Kathy.
Thanks, Diane. That's funny because I think I've said it about 20 times that e-bikes are a legit use on public lands, and as long as they are where they should be. And so thank you. You'll hear it again. Everybody will hear it a couple of times when I do my presentation. But like Diane said, my name is Kathy Bushnell. I'm the Helena District Ranger, and we can go to the next slide so we can move past that picture and the next slide there too. For the sake of my presentation, so as far as the Forest Service goes, our policy, we have e-bikes and e-mountain bikes. That's the other acronym that you see there. I'm just going to call it, for the ease of this, e-bikes. It includes both. And so I also want to thank everybody for joining. I hear we have about 80 people, which is pretty incredible. So thanks for taking time to watch this. So like I said once already, I'll say it again, e-bikes are okay on public lands as long as they're where they should be. And for that, you know, we have, as far as the Forest Service goes, I'll talk nationally, our policy, and then move into more of a local approach of how we do this management standpoint from the Helena side. So the Forest Service policy is that e-bikes fall within our 2005 travel management rule as a motorized vehicle. So we manage e-bikes as motorized vehicles. And so, and as part of that, I think it was last year, the Forest Service had opened up a public comment period to for the classification of e-bikes, so classes 1 through 3. And that information, that was to provide us new or more updated information in our directives. So next slide, please. So here you can see what the Forest Service definition is of an e-bike, e-mountain bike, and the classifications that are in our directives now. And it really mirrored what Eric had up earlier as part of his presentation. So adding, what this did was this national guidance has given us at a local level the information and the definition that allows for us to evaluate on a local level what, if anything, we're going to change within our trails management and travel planning management process. And so that gave us the more detailed guidance on how we would do that locally. Next slide, please. So speaking of locally, so Helena district is part of a recreation trail zone. So we actually manage our recreation program as a zone with the Townsend Ranger District. And for those who don't know or are not familiar with the Helena area or the Helena district, I can just give you a brief summary of what that covers. So the Helena portion of the zone covers the whole divide area, which is west of Helena, south and northwest of Helena. It goes from the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest south up to about Nevada Mountain, which is up toward Lincoln, Montana. And we manage the Gates of the Mountains Wilderness, the North Belts, the North Big Belt Mountains, and then the west side of the Elkhorn Mountains. So that's basically the Helena district. But all the information that I provided you is for our entire Helena Townsend zone. So as you can see, we have 266 miles of motorized trails that are currently available to use mountain bikes on right now. And e-bikes are allowed on our roads that are open to motorized use, both seasonally and year round. And so you can see the mileage there. It's 883 miles that are open for that use. Next slide, please. So as far as what we're going to do locally, so the direction that we have nationally is that e-bikes are motorized vehicles and will be managed as such. Any change in any designation of trails for uses. So if we were to want to look at trails that are now non-motorized and change them to motorized in order to allow e-bikes, we would have to reinitiate what we call the travel management planning analysis process. And that would be looking at all travel management. We would not open it up just for e-bike use. So, and that is a long process. Anyone who's a local, we just recently ended or completed our travel management process for the Divide travel plan. And that was a multi-year process. And so it is all encompassing and it's very comprehensive. So and there are a lot of reasons why we would why we need to go through that process. At this point, I can tell you for me locally, I'm in that second bullet, it talks about the local decision makers, one who would reinitiate that process if needed. And that would be me or my boss, a forest supervisor. And at this point, that is not something that is up for consideration because we just recently, like I said, completed part of our travel plan. Other areas of the district I know have older travel plans, but it's just not a priority right now for changing or going through that entire process for one new use. We're always going to have new recreational uses happen on public lands, and that is totally fine. We want that to happen where it's allowed to be, and we can't always just reinitiate our multi-year analysis processes just to accommodate one new use at a time. So generally, that's where I am as far as reopening travel management planning. That won't be happening on the district. But what we will be doing is working with our partners, all of the people that you heard already, plus who you'll hear from soon, is working on both an education aspect for the public and for our visitors to know how to safely and respectfully use the public lands so that everyone can enjoy them. So I totally got off track because I wasn't looking at my slides. So next slide, please. Sorry about that. Oh, no, I wasn't totally off track. I was getting there. So, okay. So as far as what I was just saying about working with our partners, I would agree with, I just want to echo what Mary said earlier. The partnerships, especially in pockets of the Helena area, are key to helping the public understand that jigsaw puzzle that you guys saw in a previous slide. Not only do we have a jigsaw puzzle for who is the land manager of some of these pieces of land, it's also the different uses of what might be available on those jigsaw pieces. So what I mean by that is, I just told you about the Forest Service policy and that e-bikes are motorized vehicles within our policy. There are other agencies that have a different policy and they border Forest Service. So it's really key for all of us to take a coordinated approach to how we share information and when and with whom we share that information to ensure that we're getting it out to the people who need to know. And so I think that's why this webinar is such a great idea, is because we have a lot that we have been doing on a coordinated approach for, managing the trails, especially in the South Hills, and trying to coordinate all of the different ways we as land managers manage those trails, but also including some of the private landowners who are part of that jigsaw puzzle. And so we have the opportunity and the challenges of trying to coordinate that management already. And I think that really gives us a strong foundation to work from as we open that coordination discussion up to new uses such as e-bikes. And so I would say that we are in no way do we have the answers already, but I think what Eric was saying, that grassroots group to help collaborate on ways forward and next steps will be key. And we have success stories in Helena already. So I think it's going to be a really great approach for this topic specifically as well. But we also have, a lot of the logistics to work through. So depending on how different agencies or entities go through their own public process on e-bikes specifically or other uses in the future, we will be there to coordinate on how we can educate by putting signs up or that sort of thing. So there isn't a solid answer to how we're going to do it, but we're all committed. That's why I think that's why we're all here. We're all committed to it. And so I think that success is on the horizon. One thing that we have encountered too this past year to year and a half is a new, what we call user group, which is brand new visitors to the forest. Those people, I mean, a lot of us, I'm imagining a lot of us on this webinar right now already look to the outdoors to be refreshed, to go have fun, to relax. But what we've seen in the last year or so is a new group of people who haven't gone outside and haven't gone to the forest for that. And so it's all brand new to them. And so not only do we have new uses that we need to describe our policies and management ways that way, we have this whole new group of people who are just now getting into the forest literally and figuratively and helping them learn all of those regulations as we're moving through all the changes that might be on the horizon for some of the recreation uses. So it's complex, I would say, but like I said, we're committed to it. I think we have a solid foundation here in Helena to work through it. But I think we do have some challenges ahead, especially just for the definitions and what e-bikes are, where they're allowed, and how we would manage that collectively. But maybe it's not all the same. It's just getting the information out on what the differences are and where e-bikes are and are not allowed. So with that, I can hand it back over to Diane.
Thank you. Really instructive. I think it's, I'm just amazed and really enjoying this, learning more about those puzzle pieces, both as involved in trail and recreation planning in my community. I've had a few light bulbs go on during putting this presentation together, but also as a user. I think as we're seeing in Whitefish, you're seeing in Helena, we're going through transformation process right now with people, where they live, how they play, where they play, how they recreate, where they can choose to live now because of remote working, where they can choose to live because are making life choices because of COVID. It's sort of put a pressure cooker on all of that. So I applaud all of you for the work that you're doing in coordinating the approach. And like Kathy said, there are a lot of issues coming up. I mean, enforcement is really a challenge. Safety is a challenge. Managing multiple uses and user conflicts is a challenge that we've maybe have been able to skate so far. Don't ask, don't tell. But I think that will change, is changing. So with that, so we're in our trail odyssey. We're moving from town through the Helena open land system onto the Forest Service land. We have that continuity, but we also have regional opportunities that are magnets for outdoor recreation, like Copper City, like Scratch Gravel Hills that's on the drawing board. So I'm going to turn it over now to Brad as another key federal partner in providing the outdoor recreation that we rely on for quality of life, economics, and health, and tell us about the BLM's approach.
Sure. Thanks, Diane. Next slide, please. So, guys, I have several jobs that I do for the BLM. I am the one of two recreation planners in the Butte field office. And just for some perspective, the Butte field office kind of looks like a giant triangle on the map. It goes clear up to the Augusta area, so the Rocky Mountain front, clear down to Carbella, just outside Yankee Jim Canyon at Yellowstone, and then over to the west towards Wisdom. So we only manage 350,000 acres of land, but it's spread across 7.2 million acres. And we do have one law enforcement officer. So he is based in Helena. He does his best to stay on top of things, but sometimes it's tricky. So I'm the rec planner in Butte. I'm also the travel management program lead for BLM Montana Dakotas. So I help all of our different offices with travel management concerns, which includes e-bikes. And then finally, I'm lucky enough to be the National Motorized Recreation Subject Matter Expert for our Washington office. And that's a job I really enjoy as well. And so you can imagine I talk about motorized and e-bikes a lot. Next slide, please. Okay, so unfortunately, there has been a ton of confusion, misinformation, lots of other words could be used about BLM's relatively new e-bike policy. So I'm here to kind of set the record straight, give the facts on where they're allowed and how they are actually defined. So back in late August of 2019, former Secretary of the Interior Bernhardt under the Trump administration issued Secretarial Order 3376. That order basically directed almost all of the land management agencies within DOI, so that includes BLM, Park Service, Forest Service, BOR, to expand their e-bike access on public lands. And for BLM specifically, it directed us to revise our off-highway vehicle regulations. And a lot of people get confused about that. Basically, in our CFR, off-highway vehicle refers to a motorized vehicle. They just chose to call them OHVs in the CFR. So if you hear me say that today, just think general motorized vehicles. Next slide, please. So when we got the secretarial order, we followed that and opened a public process nationally. So proposed rule to revise our regulations, again, our OHV regulations, was published in the Federal Register a little over a year ago. We had a 60-day public comment period. We received over 24,000 comments. So as Diane has said, and everyone else, very passionate subject. And we received all kinds of comments, the entire gamut of what you would expect. Comments incorporated into the final rule as best we could. And that was published on November 2nd. And then once a rule is published into a Federal Register, it takes 30 days. So it became effective on December 2nd of just last year. So it's about 6 months ago. And we believe that our final rule is in line with Secretarial Order 3376. Next slide, please. So we have, BLM has descriptions and then we have formal definitions, and I'll go through both really quickly. Because again, I feel like there's been a lot of misinformation that was unfortunately put out by the press. I don't feel like we as an agency did as good of a job as we could have explaining what the issues with e-bikes are and where they are and aren't allowed. So again, I'm hoping this will really help folks understand. So the rule that we came up with, the new CFR, basically amends the old version and allows us to define e-bikes. And here's a general description: small electric motor, not more than 750 watts, 1 horsepower. E-bikes may have 2 or 3 wheels, but must have fully operable pedals. That's a very, very key component of this. Some e-bikes only provide motorized assistance when the rider's pedaling. That would be class 1 and class 3. And then some e-bikes, class 2, for example, provide assistance to the rider until speed reaches 20 miles an hour. Others cease to provide motorized assistance when the bike reaches 28. So that's class 3 in this case. Next slide. So here are our formal definitions. They look very similar to what Kathy just explained, are relative to the Forest Service. So class 1 is pedal assist up to 20. Class 2 may be used exclusively to propel the bicycle with a throttle. But the way our final rule says, it actually says it must be at least being assisted by the rider pedaling. And then class 3, e-bikes are equipped with a motor up to 28, and that's pedal assist. Next slide. So what does the new rule do? And this is perhaps the most important part of my message that I want to get across to folks today. We did formally define them like I just provided. The rule provides that authorized officers may authorize through a land use planning or implementation level planning process the use of class 1, 2, and 3 e-bikes on non-motorized trails. The rule provides managers the ability to exclude e-bikes that meet certain criteria, that would be the definitions I just showed, from the off-highway vehicle CFR. So what that means is there is now an exemption in the CFR that says a local land manager can make that decision if he or she decides that e-bikes should be allowed in a specific area on non-motorized trails. He or she has the authority to do that. Where most of the confusion stemmed from with the order is almost everyone in the country took the secretarial order to be self-executing. It was absolutely not. It was written so that local managers could go through, like I said, a planning process and determine if e-bikes are appropriate in a specific area, considering all the other resources we deal with, social conflicts, and general recreation and travel management concerns. So again, I'm going to read that bottom part just so everyone is very clear. The rule, however, does not result in any immediate on-the-ground changes or site-specific allowances for e-bike use on BLM lands. The rule does not by itself open any non-motorized trails to e-bike use. Before on-the-ground changes can occur, an authorized officer must issue a land use planning. So you've probably heard in the BLM resource management plan, that's our RMP process, equivalent to forest planning level, a forest plan with the Forest Service, or an implementation level decision, which in the BLM world is a travel management plan. And obviously they have to comply with NEPA and other applicable legal requirements. Next slide, please. So what public lands are affected by this change to the CFR? It does not directly affect any BLM lands, specific BLMs, for the reason I just gave you guys. It still has to be authorized by a local officer. So in most cases, that will be done through the field manager of a specific unit. In some cases, you might get a decision from a district manager, but most of the time it's going to be a field manager. Next slide. So how can you tell which trails are open to BLM? Pretty simple. Think of it just like the Forest Service. If it's a motorized trail, you are allowed to use your e-bike on it currently with no needed additional planning. There are going to be most likely certain areas around the country where e-bikes will be allowed on roads and trails that were previously limited to traditional bicycles. But again, as highlighted, only if a manager has issued a written decision authorizing their use. Obviously, there's lots of places to get information about this, but just think of it this way: motorized areas and trails are good. You're allowed to ride there. You can also reach out to your local BLM office for more information. That's probably the best step, I would say, to take to determine if an area that you're interested in is open to e-bikes. And then we have a set of maps at this very bottom website link, which shows nationally some of the areas where e-bikes are allowed. I think they're in Moab, a couple more others in Utah, and we're working to expand that list. Next slide, please. So this is one we get a lot. We got this question a lot last fall, as you can imagine, during hunting season. It's becoming very popular to use an e-bike to retrieve game, tow a game cart, and then help the hunter remove the animal. So again, unless specifically authorized by the local officer, e-bikes may be used to travel cross country only in areas that were designated as open. We have very few open OHV areas in Montana. I manage one. It's called Raidersburg, south of Townsend. So that open means you can travel wherever you want. You do not have to stay on a trail system. So that would be one place where you could use like a game retrieval cart. And then similar to the e-scooters, e-skateboards, game carts themselves, does this apply to them? The answer is no. They are still all considered motorized vehicles because we did not formally define them in the CFR, which we have now for e-bikes. Next slide, please. So what needs to occur? Like if you have a specific area that you are considering or would like to propose to BLM to consider e-bikes, typically the best approach there is to call the local office that you're interested in, talk to the recreation planner, see what their plans are, similar to what Kathy described about future travel planning. Travel planning is a very big effort for both the BLM and the Forest Service. It usually takes multiple years. But typically we can at least tell you what's on the horizon, what we plan to do in terms of evaluating certain areas. Next slide. This is absolutely the best place to get e-bike information relative to BLM programs. So it's just blm.gov/programs/recreation/e-bikes. Or if you just Google BLM e-bikes, it will take you to our webpage. What I really like about it is the recreation planners in Washington came together and did a really great frequently asked questions section. So I feel like a lot of questions that folks have are fairly easily answered on that webpage. Next slide. So how does this all translate back to Helena? Kind of closing the loop here. Again, e-bikes in the Butte field office, which includes the Helena Valley, are currently allowed on all motorized travel routes, just like the Forest Service. We have hundreds of miles that are open to motorized. In the Helena Valley itself, currently you can ride an e-bike on the road system at North Hills. They're not allowed in the Scratch Gravel Hills currently because we're actually analyzing them right now as part of our recreation area management plan project that's been mentioned several times today. And then possible future areas where we may consider to do analysis are North Hills. BLM has as you probably know, if you're in the Helena Valley, we have an issue with shooting up there. So we have some things to work through with that, but we hope to analyze that area as well as what we call the McMaster's areas, which were given over to us by the McMaster's family. We currently have trails out there as well that we hope to analyze for e-bikes in the future. So with that, I will hand it back over to Diane.
Thank you. So a couple of things that was great, and I do have to commend the BLM on their website. It is really very user friendly from a user perspective, from a research perspective. Like I don't know how your folks managed to coordinate a volume of information in an accessible way, but I do have to commend that website. So here's a first. Number one, it's a first to have this many guests. Number two, it's a first for us to have an hour and a half webinar. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a poll here on Zoom. And the first poll question is, it's a complex topic. It's really needs, we really need to be working together. You have a lot of capacity in Helena, but a lot of communities are going to be facing the same thing, and especially communities that maybe don't have the capacity that you all do. And I will say, we have folks signed up across the spectrum, across the state, across agencies, state and federal, local trail systems, big trails, small trails, etc. So it's a topic that's of note. So please take a few minutes and look at which of these topics are, or if I've missed any that you would like to hear more about. Please, if you have an other topic that you'd like to drill down on, you can add that. We'd also like to figure out what's the best way to dig down a little deeper. Do we have a 4-hour session with experts from other places? Do we have an episode series, maybe 4 different episodes on different topics, really drill down? And thirdly, now we're starting to be able to ask this question now, a preference for virtual versus in person. So if you take a few minutes and do that, while you're doing that, I will tell you, I don't know if I got all of the links to the resources, but at the end of this presentation and on the Montana Access Project website, we will pull out links to the resources, so you don't have to go through the entire presentation to look those up. I think I got most of the references to the Code of Federal Regulations, which is CFR. Most to the policies, trends, participation, etc. Okay, so let's go through some of the questions. I want to commend all of the speakers. You were just spot on time, and we do have time to address a few questions that are in the Q&A. One question is, well, I think we've kind of answered it, but what are the incentives for land managers to accommodate e-bikes on motorized trails? I think we talked about that. If anyone of you feels that you have something to add, you can. For Kristi, e-bikes from e-scooters, do you have any guidance on that, or is it something that maybe you'll address during the collaborative your process?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I hope to address it during our process. At the initial stages of sort of looking at doing this public process on e-bikes, we ended up sort of defining e-bikes and e-scooters very similarly, or they sort of fell under the same sort of basic definitions that we had currently. So I think at some point we'll have to sort of potentially suss them out.
Thank you. We have another question about, and it gets into this tricky issue about turning off pedal assist and turning an e-bike into a non-e-bike. And I think it's probably a deeper discussion about the technical aspects of e-bikes and policy, unless anyone has a ready answer to that, yes or no. We can put that on the list for things to discuss in a deeper dive. Anyone want to grab that one? Okay, so let me look quickly at the chat. Let's see. All right, so I think we will be in touch with the results of the poll. Oh, we have one more question from here in Whitefish. Criteria for evaluating which trails are e-bike appropriate. Has anyone dealt with that issue? Or should we put it on the list for the deeper dive? Okay, deeper dive. So to finish up here, we have 4 minutes left. We're planning our next quarter episodes, but to finish out this quarter, our next webinar coming up is scheduled for June 8th, and we will unpack the 2021 Montana legislative session for parks, trails, and front country developed recreation. We'll feature some flathead victories, and quite frankly, there were several victories for trails, grant funding programs, additional funding for state parks, and more outdoor recreation infrastructure funding, and continued outdoor recreation infrastructure funding. Next slide. Contacts, here are the emails. Just as a bit of housekeeping, this webinar, this presentation, and the separate resource list will be posted on the Montana Access Project website. If you wish to share the presentation, if you wish to review the presentation materials, the PowerPoint, you're welcome to do that. And if you want to have the next slide, the resource list, I just put some resources together, both from the content of our speakers. So there's a Moab e-bike guide, Boise's policy, generally Missoula's policy, Park City's policy, including their municipal code on non-motorized trail use, links to the BLM website on e-bikes. I also included the motor vehicle use map for the forest, which is the go-to place for the places that e-bikes are allowed. Not necessarily on the interactive map, but this is the go-to place for the places that e-bikes are permitted. And I included a few of those comments that various groups have made. It's not exhaustive. It's just things that I ran across that I thought were interesting. E-bikes and wildlife from the National Wildlife Federation. We had an article here in the Flathead about bears and bikes. IMBA's, which is the International Mountain Biking Association's position on e-mountain bikes. The American Hiking Society, and I also have to point you to People for Bikes, because boy, they have done a very, very thorough research, policy, white papers, examples, pilot projects, like remarkable toolkits It's a remarkable resource for e-bikes. And again, remember, this presentation only dealt with that little bitty tip of the funnel of e-bikes. So there's a vast amount of information available about e-bikes, e-bike use, and the future of e-bikes. Because as someone said in here, they're here to stay, which I think they are. I think we will continue to see them escalate in use. And as we got one more comment from Doug Haberman, who was very involved in the legislative session this year about how do we keep considering overall transportation and e-bike management. Absolutely key. And People for Bikes has great resources with that. Again, this episode was really focused on the e-bike use in non-motorized natural surface trail areas. So with that, we're right on time. I'm going to thank everyone and thank our panelists for participating and thank all our guests. And we're going to wrap up. So thank you again. Tune in June 8th.